Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, we're talking about why there are so few female bishops, pastors, elders, and overseers in church history. Now, this might be an easy question for a lot of you, right? Of course, we know why there's so few or why they don't exist. It's because the Bible clearly says women shouldn't be in this position. Well, I don't think that's true, but either way, it still doesn't explain what actually happened in history. And this is important because many complementarians, people that, for the most part, don't want women to be pastors, would say things like the only reason people today want women to be pastors is because of culture, not listening to what the Bible actually says, kind of like people do with homosexuality. Or they'll say that if God wanted women to be pastors, it's a view that would have been held in the early church. That's also said that there are many times in church history where there aren't women leaders, so belief in allowing women to be pastors, it must not be biblical. Now, this is based on the idea that beliefs of people earlier than us had special access to us and we don't have it today, so we should trust them, or that God was guiding the beliefs of the church throughout history, and that there must be some non-biblical reason for why something like allowing women to be pastors is all of a sudden a new view. Otherwise, it wouldn't be held today. But to people who have studied the topic, there is no doubt that there was lots of women leaders all throughout the church. With that being said, it's still very true that they were very, very, very rare. It still needs to be explained. Why does church history so overwhelmingly have more men than women in church leadership? And if there were women who led the early church, like Phoebe, Junia, Priscilla, what happened so early that early Christians would stop letting women leaders lead? And why does it seem like nobody really questioned the banning of women leaders when we look at what they say throughout church history? So this is a really difficult question because we don't actually have any explicit text that give us these answers. With that being said, we do have a lot of things, a lot of reasons to come up with possible reasons for what could be happening here. We can make lots of inferences for what actually happened. And this is important first to dive into what really needs to happen for a false belief to be popular. Surprisingly, it's actually really easy. So if we want to ask why did some of the earliest people in the early church, why did they reject women being leaders? Why do we not see women bishops very early? Let's talk about how false beliefs come about, okay? And an obvious one, something that happens today, is just people that are in charismatic leadership. In other words, they're very charismatic, they're loud, they're confident. And lots of times that alone is all you need to win someone. To win a group of people, to be convinced, all you have to do is say really confident things because, well, of course they're right. Otherwise they wouldn't be confident about it, right? And additionally, someone with strong personal influence or perceived authority could also have a really big influence on a community. For example, followers may accept the belief because they trust the leader's judgment and spiritual insight. Irenaeus was fighting a heresy of his time, and he says he got his teachings from Polycarp, who got them from John, who got them from Jesus. Therefore, you should listen to what he says. And this would probably sound great to the early church, right? I mean, you're so close to Jesus, you probably know what he said, so of course we should trust you. But at the same time, let's actually think about it. Like, I mean, assuming Polycarp was telling the truth, assuming the people who told him this were telling the truth, did he really know everything that Jesus taught? Or did everything that Irenaeus taught, was that all from Jesus, every single little bit? And did he represent Jesus correctly? And did the message get misinterpreted along the way? Did John even understand the message to begin with? Those are all questions we don't know. So even someone with a position where you would think that maybe he would know what Jesus said, there's also a high possibility that he didn't know what Jesus said. We can't simply trust him, but lots of times we don't ask these questions when we're thinking of trusting people. And this happens today, okay? So you ask your friend, okay, why do you believe that? And the person says, oh, it's because of this. And then you'll be like, well, I don't know if you should believe because of this reason. And they'll be like, oh, that makes sense. Maybe that is a good reason to reject it. But you should ask Pastor Jim, Pastor Tim. They know the answer. That's where I got it from. I'm sure they know it because they're so smart and intelligent and educated. But like, it's not like pastors or leaders in churches are authoritative in regards to, not making mistakes and that they're always right. So what we have, the reason I bring that up is we have someone even today that all the time we'll get people that it's just easy to trust people, and what will happen is you'll have people that follow the beliefs without like any strong reason to do so. The point being, it's really easy to just follow someone for not even a strong reason. Another reason why someone might follow a belief, even though it might not completely be based on the original evidence, is because of cultural influence. So belief can gain traction because it resonates with the culture or historical context of the time, even if it lacks strong theological or scriptural grounding. So for example, someone like Clement might have said hypothetically, oh, women can't be pastors because the early priests of the Old Testament, they were not allowed to have women priests. But someone listening to Clement might have said, that's interesting, but also women can't, they shouldn't be priests and they shouldn't be leaders because women are terrible and they're evil. They're like Eve. See, what'll happen is the belief of someone isn't always fully based on the original reason for the tradition, why the belief is started. Sometimes the original belief isn't even that great to begin with, and there will be extra reason, but the extra reason also isn't a good reason to begin with either. So you have this continual line of belief where each person is accepting the belief for entirely different reasons. Another way that this starts is there's formal institutional endorsement. In other words, when you get a whole bunch of people together and they formally codify in church documents or creed or catechisms what these laws become, these church laws, they become essentially law to people for whatever reason. I don't know the full psychological reason behind it. If something is a law to someone, if it's put in the list of rules for the church, oftentimes that just becomes the lay of the land, what you have to accept. It even gets placed on a similar level to the Bible, so that what's actually in the Bible doesn't even matter really. So a perfect example is today, like lots of people will say, hey, we should believe this because the Westminster Catechism says that. But it's like, why should we accept them? They were like written 1500 years later or whatever. They didn't have any special access. Simply being written down often is enough for people to accept something. And then you have scriptural support, of course. All you need for someone to accept a view is another person to quote a scripture verse. Doesn't have to be in context, doesn't have to be the original meaning. As long as you just quote it and it sounds somewhat right and you say it confidently, oftentimes that's enough to convince people of your position. Even today on Facebook and YouTube comments, all the time I'll get people that just quote a verse as if that's all you need to make an argument. And then, of course, what becomes the norm is often taken as authoritative. All you have to do is have one prominent person say women should not be included in ministry, And no matter how nonsensical position the view originally is, it could have become the norm. And once something is the norm, things essentially become scripture. I mean, if you've ever been a part of a church in the 21st century today where you're trying to figure out if they should change the music, to update it, to go from hymns to contemporary music, there have been entire churches that have separated off of a small issue like that. The difference between songs are keeping 3 hymns each service and 1 contemporary song. That's been the most terrible thing for a lot of people. Or something like tithing, where tithing is not based on the Bible. You can check out my interview with Dr. David Croteau on that topic, but yet people have all kinds of reasons for accepting it, and then once that is accepted as the tradition of what you should do, then people accept it. And I say all of these reasons to say all of these could possibly be related to why we have such an early time in church history where there wasn't women leaders or pastors or elders, even though there were still a lot. So let's actually talk about the real topic, like what we know from the evidence. So what led to the decline originally? What happened so that there were lots of women leaders to pretty much no women leaders? And first of all, I've noted that there was a shift from what Paul and the apostles said when following their written scripture. In other words, you had what Paul said, what the apostles said, the churches said. You have the views of the time, and then you have a period where the scripture, like the letters that Paul wrote, or Peter, or Timothy, or whatever, those passages, Revelation, it gets written down on paper, and we don't have as close of a line of tradition anymore from what Paul and the apostles said. So what happens is scripture, what's actually written down, the letters that Paul wrote, those become more authoritative. And the problem with that is that women at the time, for the most part, could not read. It was mostly men that could read. And the big issue is that what you would end up doing is the only people that could actually understand or read the scripture were men. So of course the men are going to be leaders. Like, why would you want a woman to be a leader if she couldn't even read what Paul originally said? So that is one cultural reason why we could see a push for men to be more likely to be a leader at the time. And then there was a shift towards infant baptism. And what that meant is that women were no longer needed for decency. See, there was a time where women would be, or, people in general would be baptized, and oftentimes they would be baptized naked. And for, male leaders, well, that would be seen as indecent, okay? That would not be seen as a good thing to see a naked person, especially a child. And therefore, what happened was, okay, well, women should fill that role. They should do the baptisms. But then later, there was a shift from, full water baptism to an infant baptism. And they no longer needed the women to fulfill this role. There was no problem with it, decency anymore. And then another reason why this shift occurred is because churches began to be modeled after the temple. This is similar to the priesthood idea.
And now let's jump up another 10 years. This is Eusebius again, another document that he wrote, an oration in praise of Constantine. He was Constantine's biggest fan, and he wrote a bunch of good stuff for them. Eusebius, by the way, is a bishop of the church at Caesarea. And he says this: our Savior, through Constantine, once more adorned the world with holy temples and consecrated houses of prayer in every city and village, ordaining the erection of churches and sacred buildings to the honor of the supreme God and Lord of all. These hallowed edifices are called churches or houses of the Lord. Interesting, what's happening here is Constantine, after he became a Christian, he started building churches. And we're not talking about these Morton buildings. We're talking about lavish, extravagant cathedrals. And Eusebius calls them holy temples and consecrated houses of prayer, sacred buildings, hallowed edifices. And here he described what he means by ecclesia, houses of the Lord. This phrase is interesting, houses of the Lord, because like temples, the phrase house of the Lord in the Bible only refers to the Jewish temple. And yet he's starting to call Christian church buildings temples, houses of the Lord. This had never been done before. And it's something of a departure from the ideas that we found in the New Testament. So let's come to one conclusion here based on what you've seen so far. By 320, Christians began using temple terminology in reference to their meetings and meeting places.
Kevin Madigan and Carolyn Osick and ordained women in the early church, they write the motif of blood as uncleanliness, unworthy of the purity of the altar, was one of the most common reasons given for the exclusion of women from altar service. Once the celebration of the Eucharist acquired the connections with cultic purity that accompanied the understanding that it replaced temple sacrifice. Women stopped from being deacons because of their monthly cycle, as expressed by Matthew Blastaris, which was a 14th century monk. This is Matthew Blastaris, alphabetical collection 11. He says, women deacons then fulfilled a certain service among the clergy, which is nearly unknown to everyone now. There are some who say that they baptized women because it was not proper for men to see undressed those being baptized who were of a certain age. Others say that they were allowed to approach the holy altar and perform nearly all the functions done by male deacons. And this is where he gets to the good point. He says they were forbidden access and performance of these services by later fathers because of their monthly flow that cannot be controlled. So he acknowledges that there are women who baptized earlier and then they were stopped because they had monthly flow that cannot be controlled. Another person that says this is something similar is Passapalia and Sicard of Cremona. Both of those are 12th and 13th century. Sicard of Cremona basically says women shouldn't enter church after being pregnant. So that's a little odd. But of course, you're not going to be a leader in a church if you can't go to church when you're pregnant or even after. And then Sandra Glahn, in her book, she mentions how there was a redefining of the priesthood. She says that there was a shift away from emphasizing the priesthood of all believers, is what we see in 1 Peter 2:9, and it led to an all-male priesthood in the pattern of the Old Testament. The church looked to the past rather than the future kingdom in its view of the telos of men and women. In other words, they saw, hey, this is what happened in the Old Testament, therefore we should do this today.
Shift number 2 is that the ministers become priests, because if you're going to view the Lord's Supper as a sacrifice, then the table on which it sits becomes an altar. This is pagan thinking. This is also Jewish thinking. They all had altars. And what do you offer on the altar? The sacrifice. Well, now Christians are starting to do the same thing. They've got their altar and they've got their sacrifice. And then step number 3, another shift number 3 really, is that ministers become priests. And again, this makes sense, because if you've got a sacrifice that sits upon an altar, then the person presiding over that altar and that sacrifice must be a priest. And as early as 95 AD, Clement has a comment that kind of gets this idea going that our ministers are priests, literal priests. He says, the Master commanded us to perform at the appointed times the offerings and services. The offerings and services. For to the priests, the proper office has been assigned, and upon the Levites, the proper ministries have been imposed. He's hailing back to Old Testament ideas, and he's seeing himself and other bishops as the fulfillment of this type, anti-type kind of idea. The type is the priest in the Old Testament, and now he is a priest in the New Testament idea. But as we know, and we looked at this in weeks number 2 and 3, all Christians are priests. That's something confirmed a number of times in the New Testament. It never identifies ministers or any kind of clergy individuals as some special elite class of holy people who should be called priests. We are all the holy priesthood in the New Testament. Jumping up to 105, Ignatius, in his letter to the Smyrnians, says, only that Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop, or whomever he designates, is to be considered valid. Now, he doesn't use the word priest here, but the idea here is that you cannot partake of the Lord's Supper unless a bishop is the one who is presiding over that sacrifice on that altar with the priest. See, the power is starting to get slowly invested in these few people who are now in this key role over the church. Let's jump up to 190 AD. Irenaeus writes here, he says, all the apostles of the Lord are priests who do inherit neither lands nor houses, but they serve God and the altar continually. Now, he doesn't say that all Christians are priests. He says that the apostles are priests. He doesn't say that the ministers are priests, but he's starting to think that, well, the apostles definitely were priests. But is that found in the New Testament? No, it's not. Advancing up to 200, Tertullian writing, he says he's upset with some heretics, some bad Christians who are going off in a wrong tangent. He says their ordinations in their churches are carelessly administered, capricious, and changeable. At one time they put novices in office, for even on laymen do they impose the duties of priesthood. Now here you're definitely getting to see a clergy-laity distinction developing by 200 AD, where you don't see that in the New Testament. Everybody is one. And you remember Jesus, whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And he talked to the elders, don't lord it over anybody. You're to be the servant of all. But here, only certain people can be priests, and the bad people are ones who allow laymen to be priests. Jumping up to 250, Cyprian goes hog wild with this idea of ministers being priests. He refers to it so many times. This is a good example here in one of his epistles. He says, I hear that certain presbyters, these are like elders, neither mindful of the gospel nor giving the bishop the honor of his priesthood and of his dignity, are already communicating with the lapsed and giving them the Eucharist. See, only the priests can administer the Eucharist. And in the New Testament, it's a meal that everybody enjoys when they sit around in their gatherings. There's no indication that it's important who presides over the thing or who gives it to anybody. It's something everybody joins in together. But now you're in trouble if you're one of those people who are giving the Eucharist to people and not denying the bishop the honor of his priesthood and his dignity. 250 AD. Jumping up to 320, we get to Eusebius again. He has this oration where he's dedicating one of these Constantinian churches. He starts off the oration saying, friends and priests of God. He's actually talking to a room full of priests, of bishops, actual bishops. Ye who are clad in the sacred gown, adorned with the celestial crown of glory. The guys are also walking around in these sacred gowns now. It's not just a regular gown. It's a sacred gown. My goodness. And they are priests of God. Things have changed already dramatically from the first century as we enter into the 4th century here. And then if you go even further, like 380, it really should be almost off the chart here. This is the Apostolic Constitutions. It makes this amazing statement. The bishop is the mediator between God and you in the several parts of your divine worship. He is, next after God, your earthly God. I'm probably sensationalizing this a little bit too much, but the cojones on these guys just amazes me how much they viewed themselves. And now they're not just priests, they are earthly gods. They are the mediator between God and man. And in the New Testament, who's the mediator between God and man?
Jesus.
Jesus. Nobody else. There's no other layers in this whole thing. Wow. So by this time, it's taken off on its own into a world all of its own. So, another conclusion to throw at you here. By the mid-3rd century, Christians increasingly viewed their ministers as the priests who handled the sacrifice that sat upon the altar. Right.
So there's a few reasons that we know for sure. We can specifically point to strong reasons why women would be rejected from being leaders in the early church. Now, nothing of that is proved, of course, but these are possible, maybe even likely reasons why women would have been prevented from being leaders. But that also brings another question up. Why was it never questioned? So it's one thing for, at the early church, for you to go from women leaders to no women leaders, but at the same time, it seems like in church history, that idea is just very rarely questioned. There are bits and pieces here and there you can check out on my channel, and you can check out someone like Madigan and Osick's book in Ordained Women in the Early Church. But there's still the question of, okay, why didn't someone, reform the church? Or why didn't someone ever speak up and say, okay, the Bible actually does say that women can be leaders. You're misreading 1 Timothy 2. Why was it never questioned? And there's a long list of possible reasons for this. Some things are more certain than others. We'll talk about it. So, first thing I want to point out there is that there was actually a lot of things that never questioned, more obvious things. So, like, for example, slavery, okay? Pretty much all throughout history, slavery was accepted and promoted, and yet, very recently, it was rejected. It's an obvious thing where you would think that the early church would have rejected it, but didn't. And then another thing that was really never questioned was the low value of women. As we'll see in a number of different texts, there are all kinds of texts where women are just seen as just terrible, lack of value. They're seen as basically stupid, and for the most part, we don't really ever see that idea ever being questioned. Why would we never see that question when the Bible clearly has such a high view of women? So, some of these will be restated from the earlier reasons. There's a little bit of overlap, but let's get into the reasons. Why was these views never questioned? Specifically, the idea that women leaders weren't allowed. For the most part, they weren't ever questioned. So one tradition became on the level of the Bible in some ways. Now, of course, even Catholics today would say that a lot of tradition is actually on the, not on the level, but some would certainly say that it's on par with the Bible, that what we know from Paul and the other apostles, that it was carried on throughout church history, and that's why there are certain Catholic beliefs today, like the Eucharist. With that being said, this new tradition of women not being allowed to be leaders, it became essentially on the level of the Bible. We talked about why tradition does that. Now, whether that's justified is a different question, but when it shouldn't be a surprise that something that is tradition would never be questioned. It doesn't often get questioned, especially in earlier times. Now, there were lots of cultural reasons that were not based on the Bible to think women shouldn't be leaders. For one, women primarily weren't educated. Women were seen as lesser than. Women rarely had the chance to show that they could contribute. When they did contribute, women suddenly got all kinds of great roles. They were put in high positions. But if you don't ever see women that are educated or smart, then of course, why would you think that women should be put in these types of roles? There's a fun story where there was I think it was a monastery in the Middle Ages. This is in Gary Macy's book. And what happens is there were there were people that were essentially giving women the chance to educate themselves, and what would end up happening is that the women and the men were both a bunch of philosophers, and they were really smart, and all of a sudden you had women being put in these high positions, women being thought so highly of, and this is in the same time period where pretty much all throughout the rest of the world, women were being actively put down. They were actively saying, hey, women need to be rid of being ordained. They were just completely like, women were just like losing all kinds of different rights. So that you have one scenario where women are being put up because they are actually seen like, hey, women actually can do this, even in a time when pretty much everybody thought they couldn't. Additionally, there are arguments for women not being leaders that was readily available. In other words, the arguments for women, like for example, you know, what we would see today, they were not readily available. The scholarly arguments where people were spending all kinds of time making like really strong arguments, most people just wouldn't have been familiar with it in the early church. And you might even point to someone like Deborah or Priscilla, which might be today a strong reason to accept women being leaders. But at the same time, like, what? Think about it. If you're in the early church and you can read, which was very few, if you were someone that could read and you saw Deborah or Priscilla, it's like, okay, cool. So there's Deborah and Priscilla. That's odd that we would see a judge like Deborah or Priscilla teaching Apollos. That doesn't fit well with my view of women. And you could think of all kinds of reasons why someone would not find that very powerful of an argument, or why that wouldn't be a big deal. So I mean, it'd just be very easy to say, I don't fully understand why there's women like that, but clearly women shouldn't be rejected. That's what Pastor Jim's told me. He said, he's so much smarter, of course. And I've never met a smart woman, so why would God let people be in charge that are stupid? So I don't understand that, but we'll just reject it. In other words, if they were not aware of the strongest arguments, then it would be very easy to just reject them out of hand or see them as silly ideas when your entire belief system includes ideas that just like make it sound silly, even if those belief systems aren't that, educated to begin with. Then there you have questionable leadership. So I was reading one book that was talking about how the pagan Cyprian, he became the bishop of Carthage. This is the most powerful ecclesiastical position in North Africa. And he did this within 2 years of becoming a Christian. It took him 2 years to have the most powerful position in North Africa. How does that happen? Right? Like, you can't even get a PhD in 2 years. Lots of master's degrees you can't get in 2 years. And this person became the highest bishop of Carthage in North Africa. In other words, my point being that however that was able to happen, whoever let him be in charge clearly was not thinking clearly, and if that happened, then it seems likely that maybe the other people in charge in other places probably weren't the smartest uh, bit of the bunch. That's not a phrase anyone uses, but you get my point. Um, and then there's also people in charge. They were not unbiased experts on the Bible. People often in the early church said all kinds of ridiculous things. The most educated people like Augustine, Chrysostom, Tertullian, they said all kinds of nonsense stuff. And they didn't have sound ways to read the Bible, at least in comparison to what we have today. They had no they have no conception pretty much of what bias was and how bias affects the arguments that we use. A lot of them didn't know Hebrew. They had huge biases against women. So it's not like they were just like super smart. Like I know it sounds prideful, but like the ability and access we have today to understanding the Bible in a lot of ways is a lot better than they had. They weren't some like super unbiased experts that they would be able to um, understand the text like we can today. Um, and my point being is that, that doesn't necessarily prove that they got it wrong or something like that. But my point being is that it wouldn't be a surprise for them to get something wrong like slavery or women in ministry. Now, it's also the people that a lot of the early church fathers they dealt with. The early church fathers in general often they were pretty terrible to people they disagreed with. So like they misrepresented people all the time. They didn't spend the time to understand their views. Of course, that happens today. That's not a surprise. And even if they found a strong reason for women to be leaders, they were often not good listeners to take the time to understand it. And so they what oftentimes is that, like, for example, you would have one bishop, he wouldn't know like the best arguments for a position, whatever it is, say it's on some type of theological belief. He would actually hear it from a different bishop. Well, so of course he's going to be trusting that bishop, but what's to say that bishop is actually representing the original view correctly? What's the chances that they're strawmanning? And we see that lots of time in church history, just like we do today. And of course, if you hear like a straw man version, a view that just doesn't sound very likely, then of course you're going to reject it outright. You're going to think it's stupid, and that, of course, what would end up happening is you would have all kinds of people that would just like say terrible things about another position, completely misrepresent it, say that they're from the devil simply for believing something different about like getting to heaven or something like that. And then you have the fear of punishment. Okay, so this is not something that I would think is just like a very high likely thing, but at the same time, I think there's a real reason to think about that there was actually at this time a reason to think that if you held certain beliefs, there was a chance that you could be banished, that all your friends would reject you, that something bad could happen. There were times in church history where you could literally die. You could be killed if you had a certain belief. For example, there were times where they would chop people's heads off if they went against the church, like Priscillianism. Now, that's not something that happened often, and this question of women leaders isn't something that would be on that level of something like heresy for most of them. At the same time, there were some people that were just very emotional and very against the idea of women being leaders in church history. So it would not be a surprise to think that someone might be scared of the effects of getting on a pulpit and saying, "Hey, women should be leaders." Now, in response to women holding chalices and administering blood of Christ during the Eucharist, this is an interesting example. So there's a letter of 3 Gaelic bishops, and they say that it is not necessary for us to come to you with an apostolic scepter, mentioning 1 Corinthians 5:5, should you decline our charity and be given over to Satan and the destruction of the flesh, so that your spirit might be saved, to be given over Satan is this: when anyone has been separated from the ecclesiastical flock for his fault, let him not doubt that he will be devoured by demons as well as wolves. So you might be thinking, what is this terrible view that they're worried about here? And then later in the letter, it gets into specifics. The Gaelic bishops say, we have learned through a report of the priest Spiritus, a venerable man, in other words, he's trustworthy, that you have not desisted from carrying certain altars through the domiciles of several citizens and presume to say masses there with women, whom you call, the words con hospide, who are employed in the divine sacrifice, so that while you are distributing the Eucharist, they hold the chalices and presume to administer the blood of Christ to the people of God. This novelty and unheard of superstition saddens us not a little as such a horrendous sect. In other words, that thing that they were talking about where they were being talking about getting the destruction of Satan was talking about how what they did was essentially have women serve Eucharist. Now, not allowing women to serve was called the apostolic teaching, which was held to super high authority. And sorry, I don't remember the specific reference for this. It was either in Gary Macy's book or in Kevin Madigan and Carolyn Osick. Now, what I want people to think about is just imagine trying to go against one of the biggest church elders or bishops or even the Pope of the early church, like, or 500, 1080, whatever. Like, think about what that would be like for all of the people in the early church or just church history, the highest positions, the most educated people, to be saying women cannot be leaders. And they probably do it very confidently. They would point to Bible verses, whether context or out of context. They would make all kinds of silly arguments that we'll show later. And imagine what that would be like for someone to go against that when they don't have the strongest arguments for women being pastors. It would seem very likely that type of view would not get widely publicized or become popular, because there was a lot going against it at the time. And it's also worth mentioning that lay people didn't even have access to the Bible for a large amount of history. In other words, they couldn't even have access to any, like, even the biblical text in general. Nonetheless, these arguments for women being pastors, you had to trust, essentially, you had to trust the people in charge. That just happened to be men. And additionally, there was an emergence of scripture that we talked about earlier that prevented illiterate people from leading, and a consequence of that was many women were not able to lead. So not only do you not have women leading, or women being stopped from leading in the early church because they couldn't read scripture, but all throughout history, oftentimes women could not lead, and therefore there would be little reason to think that they would be good leaders in the church. And something else worth mentioning is that they didn't have the best egalitarian arguments, except for in bits and pieces sometimes. And they didn't have any conception of a better context of 1 Timothy 2. There was no knowledge of the manuscript tradition of 1 Corinthians 14, where the text that says women shouldn't speak in church probably was never original. They did not have really strong analysis of Deborah, Priscilla, Phoebe, and Junia. Now, certainly some church fathers did have high opinions of these women, but really, even if they did, a lot of times they were what they would call as historians would call as ambivalent. In other words, they would say that they have this really high view of women, and then they would also think women shouldn't be leaders and that all women are terrible. It's almost like they had contradicting views a lot of times. And this is not new for most people. This is like literally that's just what cognitive dissonance is. So, what we talked about here, there are multiple reasons why the tradition of women not being leaders was continued, which has nothing to do with the original reasoning. So what we're going to talk about is why did it just continue? So we talked about why it was never questioned, but why, like, what were the main beliefs for why women were not allowed to be leaders? So the obvious one, probably the biggest one, was, I'll just be honest, it's sexism. So here's a text from Epiphanius. He says, "The female sex is mistaken, fallible, and poor in intelligence. Come now, the servants of God, let us put on a manly mind and disperse the mania of these women." Origen says, "Men should not sit and listen to a woman, even if she says admirable things or even saintly things. That is of little consequence, since it came from the mouth of a woman." That's in Origen's fragment on 1 Corinthians. Tertullian in 207 around there says on the text is called "On the Remedy of Heretics" 41.523. He says, "These heretical women, how bold they are! They dare to teach, to debate, to perform exorcism, to attempt cures, perhaps even to baptize." And the thing is that Tertullian is okay if non-church authority men exercise. He bases the problem purely on their sex. And then you have John Chrysostom, 347 to 407 CE, wrote, "The woman taught once and ruined all. On this account, therefore," he says, referring to Paul, John Chrysostom says, "let her not teach. But what is it to other women that she suffered this? It certainly concerns them, for the sex is weak and fickle." This is my favorite quote because he literally calls a woman fickle. Now, personally, I don't know a lot what that means, but I don't think it's a good thing. And of course, that's not a word I use. That's on Homily 9 on 1 Timothy. And then, let's see, I can't remember what this text is from. It says, "We and our whole community of canons, recognizing that the wickedness of women is greater than all other wickedness of the world, and that there is no anger like that of women, and that the poison of aspen dragons is more curable and less dangerous to men than the familiarity of women, have unanimously decreed for the safety of our souls, no less than that for that of our bodies and goods, that we will on no account receive any more sisters to the increase of our perdition, but will avoid them like poisonous animals." Saint-Dragon notes, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was a theological and educational doctor. His view on male and female were deeply influenced by those of Aristotle, who saw women as defective and misbegotten. Then you have Desiderius Erasmus in 16th century AD, was a prominent Dutch philosopher and theologian. He said that while women was deceived by the serpent, man was impervious to such beguilement. And he quotes, the quote is, "The man could not have been taken in either way by the serpent's promises or by the allure of this fruit." And this was in the collected works of Erasmus. And then Peter Damian, he says something real fun. He says, "I speak to you, O charmers of the clergy, appetizing flesh of the devil that casts away from paradise, you poison of the minds, death of souls, venom of wine and of eating, companions of the very stuff of sin, the cause of our ruin. I say, I extort you, women of the ancient enemy, you..." Word that rhymes with witches. "Sows, screech owls, night owls, she-wolves, bloodsuckers, cry, give, give without ceasing. Come now, hear me, harlots, prostitutes, with your lascivious kisses, you whiling places for fat pigs, couches for unclean spirits, demigoddesses, sirens, witches, devotees of Diana, If any omens are found thus far, they should be judged sufficient to your name. For you are the victims of demons, destined to be cut off by eternal death. From you the devil is fattened by the abundance of your lust, is fed by your alluring feast. That's just how he was describing women. Now, there are other reasons that they were prohibited from being leaders that we talked about earlier. Then there is a mention of women in leadership being left out. So past rules about women being allowed to be leaders were missing from the decretum laws. And what would end up happening was someone would quote this text called the decretum, and they would quote all the parts where, men are leaders, and then they would not quote the parts where they have women leaders. And then we have other texts that justify why this was done, and this is done by changing the definition of deacon and presbyter. In other words, they just redefined something so that women couldn't be it. Then they called the wives of deacons, they called them the wives of deacons or presbyters. And of course, we have explicit notions of misogyny. I'll read this one text here. This was a commentary on the decretum called the Rosarium. This was by Guido de Basio. It says, "You say that a woman is not able to be ordained, as has been said above. And this is the reason, because orders are for the more perfect members of the church, since it is given for the distribution of grace to another. A woman, however, is not a perfect member of the church, but a male is." Now, there of course were lots of reasons why women were rejected from being leaders, and there were a lot of bad ones too. So let's talk about those. So the church made lots of biblical arguments. Of course, many would cite 1 Timothy 2 or 1 Corinthians 14. But let's look at their reasoning for lots of these passages. So oftentimes they would just cite verses, no justification, no additional evidence for why they take that position, what's called proof text today. Of course, that's not how sound biblical exegesis is done. You have Tertullian on baptism in 17.427 and 200 AD, around there. He says, "How credible is it that one would give a female the power to teach and baptize, who's not even allowed a woman to learn by right? Let them keep silent," he says, "and ask their husbands at home," referring to 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35. But he cites it with no argument from the context. He doesn't even make an argument that it was the original in the original text to begin with. Then you have Tertullian against Marcion, and the number is 5.8.11. He says, "Similarly, when directing women to be silent in church, that they not speak for the purpose of learning, although he, Paul, has already shown that even they have the right of prophesying when he puts a veil on the woman prophesying in 1 Corinthians 11, he took his authority for setting women in subjection from the law. Let him, Marcion, also show to me any from those especially holy women in his community who has prophesied." And what we can see is that he is okay with women prophesying, but not smart enough to realize that it contradicts his view of women speaking in church. And then later you have the First Synod of Saragossa. That's around 380, and it says in there somewhere, "Let all believing women who belong to the Catholic Church absent themselves from lectures and conventicles of foreign men, and from women giving lectures, either out of zeal for teaching or learning, since this is what the apostle commands." And they don't give any specific reasoning, no justification for it. It's just, this is what the apostle commands. They don't even mention specifically 1 Corinthians 14 or 1 Timothy 2. They don't even quote it. It's just assume this is what the apostle commands. And if you're told that 1,000 times and you're told that confidently, so much that you don't even have to cite it, well, that might essentially trick people that aren't as smart into accepting such a view. And let's see here. And just to let you know, when it says the foreign women, it's referring to the Priscillian sect. So there's also a misunderstood 1 Timothy 3:11. So Tertullian to his wife in 1.737, he says, "In so far as we can, let us love the opportunity of continence. When it first presents itself, let us resolve to accept it, so that what we could not take on in marriage, we might embrace in widowhood. The occasion must be embraced, which concludes what necessity used to command, harmful to faith." I don't know if that's a typo on me or what. "And what an impediment to sanctity second marriages are. The discipline of the church and the restriction of the apostle declare, since he does not allow twice married men to preside," referring to 1 Timothy 3:11, "and when he would not allow a woman into the order, unless she had been married to only one man. Indeed, it is fitting that the altar of God be presented pure." So in this text, there's no like hesitation at all. There's no like, oh, this is probably what it means or maybe what it means. He just references 1 Timothy 3:11, and he thinks that this idea of being married twice, that contradicts 1 Timothy 3:11, which says the husband of one wife. But it doesn't. Now, the Decretum said women weren't in the image of God. So that's a really odd one, right? The text says, "The image of God exists in the male, that he might be made the one from whom all others originate, having the dominion of God, in some sense as his representative, as he has the image of the one God. And therefore woman is not created in the image of God, for indeed it is said, and God made man, in God's image he made him." Even though that word Adam, that word for man, could also mean humanity. "Here also the apostle, a male," he said, "ought not to cover his head, because he is the image and glory of God. For that reason a woman covers her head, because she is not the glory or the image of God." That's 1 Corinthians 10:7. So of course, why would anybody expect a woman to be a leader if they're not even in the image of God? Then you have Epiphanius. He basically said, if anyone would have been a woman priest, it would have been Mary, but she wasn't. And neither were they in the New Testament. There wasn't any women priests in the New Testament. And therefore, women shouldn't be priests. That's essentially what he said. The text is a little bit longer and more convoluted. And he also says, basically, women can't be priests today because they weren't in the Old Testament. When, of course, we don't follow the Old Testament law today. So the specific text is Panarian 79:2. It says, "Courage, servants of God, let us invest ourselves with all the qualities of men and put to flight this feminine madness." So he calls what the feminine do madness. "These women repeat Eve's weaknesses and take appearance for reality, but let us get to the heart of the subject. Never, anywhere, has any woman acted as a priest for God, not even Eve. Even after her fall, she was never so audacious to put her hand to an undertaking so impious as this, nor did any of her daughters ever hereafter do so." So he's making this argument from Eve not, trying to be priest afterwards, and that Eve's daughters didn't, even though there's no text that says the daughters did or didn't. So how would he know if the daughters did, or why would that mean anything anyways? He later says, "Many men in the Old Testament offered sacrifices, but nowhere has a woman exercised the priesthood." And that's supposedly evidence for women not being allowed to be priests. And how that makes sense, how that follows, it doesn't. You can check out my interview with Mike Davis on the topic of why there weren't women priests in the Old Testament. But either way, what we've talked about today is why the early church and church in history, we're overwhelmingly not allowing women to be leaders. And then there's the question of how Phoebe, Junia, Priscilla, those people could be leaders so early, but then all of a sudden, so quickly, people were rejected from being leaders, specifically women. And why does it seem like nobody really questioned the banning of women leaders? So that's what we talked about today. I hope you guys found value in this. Let me know your objections, why you think that maybe my reasoning is off. What I will say to conclude is none of this is certain. Like, there's no certainty that, the original reason that women were rejected was because someone was just super charismatic or super loud and confident. Like, that's not something we can know. But what I want to do today is to have given a possible, plausible scenario where you can go from women leaders to no women leaders and have such a long period of time where, for the most part, there weren't women leaders. Now, you've probably heard me mention that they actually were women leaders. There were a few instances, at least, of pretty good chances of women being bishops. Then you have lots of instances where women were priests, even more of deacons and widows. What that is an interesting conversation. You can check out my other videos for that. You can check out Kevin Madigan and Karen Osick's book on that. Gary Macy's book on that. And you can also check out my interviews with them on the topic. You can also check out Barg Moskow's. She has a bunch of articles like that on her website. But otherwise, it's been fun, and I hope you guys like and subscribe. I hope you found value in this, and otherwise, I hope you have a good one.